Hello and welcome to the Tortoise newsroom. Thanks for coming, everybody. And tonight we've decided to ask the biggest question we could think of, which is, how do you change the world? So there's plenty to chew on, and I'm confident that we're going to solve it in an hour. I'm sure we are. So I'm David. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise, and yes, I'm hoping tonight we're gonna be celebrating campaigners and activists, and thinking about people who've brought positive change, whether it's in the law or through policy or in their communities or in just the way people behave towards one another. And we're doing this as part of a partnership that we've done with the Sheila McKechnie Foundation, which just had its Campaigner Awards last week. So we're lucky enough to have a couple of the people who were with their names up in lights there. And so I'm expecting we're going to hear a bit that is going to make us both inspired and angry, probably, and hopefully want to, get on the barricades. But we'll see where we go. So let me just introduce everyone to get us started. So we've got Francesca Albanese next to me from the homelessness charity Crisis. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
And we've also got Jason Evans, who's next to me, who was named Campaigner of the Year for his absolute dedication, really, to the cause of winning compensation for victims of the contaminated blood scandal, which still probably stands as the worst health scandal in modern history. So Jason, thanks for joining us. Have you come down the train from Coventry today?
I have indeed, yeah. We're on the HS2 line if it ever happens.
Yeah, if it ever happens, well, so it'll be much quicker in about 30 years' time.
That's the one.
And also we got Sue Tibbles, who's the Chief Executive of the Sheila McKechnie Foundation.
Hello.
Very nice to see you too. So I think maybe if we get started with you, Sue, just to kick us off. I suppose it would be just nice to hear what the sort of sentiment behind your annual awards are, and really what you think the issues are that you try to surface with honouring campaigners.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they're the only awards that are trying to celebrate people that are making change happen. So it's not political campaigning, it's not commercial campaigning, it's social campaigning, people trying to affect social change in the world around them. And what's really lovely about them is that we have people that are working on their own in the community, often unpaid with very little resource. People working there like Jason, who actually has managed to mobilise quite a lot of resource, right through to big charities like Crisis. So we sort of put our arms around the whole campaign community, which I guess in turn is about trying to give more visibility to campaigning. It's not really a discipline that we're sort of conscious of or that is understood. So it's also a way of sort of holding up a flag and saying, these people are campaigning, let's give them a shout out, some recognition, which doesn't come that often, frankly, does it? And enjoy the kind of warmth of people that actually are making a difference, given that it is actually quite hard to do that.
Yes, because I imagine, we'll get to it, I'm sure, but it's got to be a lonely practice sometimes.
Yes, I think, being locked up in a bedroom/home office is probably the experience of many a campaigner, certainly myself. And it can be very lonely. I think in the Infected Blood campaign, one of the negatives and positives is that so many people across the country, thousands, were impacted by it, which obviously the downside is so many people were harmed. On the other hand, it means our campaign, had a base of at least hundreds of people that we are able to mobilise to write to MPs, sign petitions, come to protests, and all the kinds of things that campaigners do.
So, Sue, what are you looking for when you trawl for nominees for your awards?
Yeah, we get sort of 120, 130 nominations. I guess a key thing with the campaign is that it's got to have won. There's got to be some tangible success that you can see. We are interested in people that have found new and interesting ways to try and drive change. And then beyond that, it's generally just a really hard-fought argument, because it's quite hard to choose often each year between some excellent nominations. So I guess you'd be looking at what things have felt really intractable and someone's managed to push through. We have an excellent judging panel. We don't make those decisions at SMK. We invite others to judge. And in fact, it's something that we keep meaning to do more of, which is try and share those conversations, because it's really interesting talking about different sorts of campaigns and which ones really we feel each year are worthy of success. But every single year, there are at least 10. We could celebrate dozens and dozens, and I wish we could.
I think I sat in on some of the judging. I didn't judge because I wasn't grown up enough, but I definitely feel like a motif of the conversation was, can we share this one?
Yeah.
And it really was that. It was almost impossible to divide people, wasn't it? But what do you think, I suppose, makes a great campaign?
Yeah, or a great campaigner. I mean, I guess the very first thing you have to have is passion, right? The whole thing is fueled by a sort of righteous indignation that something is wrong. And in which sense we are all campaigners. You know, I mean, if any of us had a relative, a child, I mean, I think quite often of parents with kids at school, the kids aren't getting what they need. You will chase down that school to try and get what that child needs. That's effectively campaigning. So you've got to be determined that something is wrong and you want to right it. I think having, at the same time, a cool mind, because you have to actually have your evidence and your facts and your argument. So you kind of want to have all the heat, but also all the kind of cool clarity of knowing what your arguments are. The other thing I would say is, in the end, you have to be able to build relationships, and including with people that might be your, you know, sworn foes. And I know from my own campaigning, people that have sworn black and blue that they take no interest in the thing I'm campaigning for have, if they felt they've changed their mind genuinely, or there's advantage in it, have turned, you know, done a complete 360 and now support you. So you have to proceed just tenaciously thinking, I just need to get to know the people that could make this change happen and build a relationship with them. And actually trust and relationships of trust are probably far more significant in change making than the heat and the noise that people associate with public protest. As important as that is, actually behind the scenes, there's an awful lot of just normal human conversation and building of trust. And we'll hear more about that today, I think, and actually how campaigns get across the line.
That's right. So, well, Francesca, let's start with getting into the detail of what Crisis did, because I think really you were talking about trying to overturn a law that had stood since the 19th century.
Yes.
What was it pointed at, and what was wrong with it?
So it was the Vagrancy Act, which is a very archaic law, both in terms of when it was set, but also kind of what it represents, which was criminalising people for being vagrants. But what that equates to in today's society is people rough sleeping. And so our campaign was very much focused on the fact it was still being used by the police and to criminalise people who are rough sleeping. And one of the areas, you know, we've touched on this already, but that kind of having your evidence and kind of understanding the issue was, it really came from people using our services. So Crisis delivers homelessness services across Great Britain, and actually we were finding that people were being arrested, criminalised themselves for rough sleeping, and real personal testimonies were kind of a big part of the campaign. But I think it was that it was also the kind of context that was in, which is, you know, all that was happening was people were being moved on. They weren't, you know, the law doesn't resolve rough sleeping. It doesn't kind of address the issue. It just pushes people further away from support, and that was essentially what we were looking at. And we didn't think that the law had its place in today's society.
See, were you doing more than one thing? I'm trying to imagine, is it a public-facing hearts and minds thing you're doing, or is it also or only something that's trying to persuade a handful of MPs to change their mind and get behind your course.
So it was both, and I think that's definitely an ingredient of a good campaign.
Okay.
So I think it's making sure you do win hearts and minds, and also you know, what Sue talked about, that that passion that we can do something about this, and you know, we want to end all forms of homelessness, but this is definitely one of the areas where we felt was, you know, there was real injustices in terms of kind of what that led to in terms of people's experiences. So it's definitely connecting with the public and talking about the issue and getting people wanting to do something about it. And we did that through kind of lived experience and personal testimonies of what that was doing to people. But it's also about, behind the scenes influencing. And we did a lot of work with backbench MPs and peers to kind of deliver this campaign and understand a bit more about kind of where people are coming from with the with how the law was used. And I think the other thing we did actually, we did work really closely with the police. So what we were wanting to understand more is, why is the 1824 Act still used by the police? Are there elements of it that actually there are reasons for why that is used? What's the alternative? And a big part of the campaign was actually us developing a best practice guide to work with practitioners, including the police, around, well, what would you do if you find somebody rough sleeping? What actually should you be doing? It's about connecting people with the right support. And actually a lot of when we talk to police commissioners and kind of more enforcement teams, actually part of it was they didn't really know what to do.
Really?
And so
just, it's a blunt instrument to just move someone along.
So part of it was also thinking about, okay, so how do we kind of make sure there's kind of better referrals into services, equipping people to know kind of how to address people rough sleeping, and knowing kind of what the solution to that was.
That actually sounds like incredibly positive, whether or not you would have success in Parliament. But just take people into that process, because how many people did you have to persuade into your corner, and how do you even get started doing that? How do you win?
So I think it very much depends, because I think, so I've worked at Crisis quite a long time, and there's actually been a number of campaigns I've been involved in, and actually sometimes it's about convincing the government to take on the law change themselves. So another kind of campaign we did a lot of work on was called the No One Turned Away campaign, which is around changing the homelessness legislation, and that actually started off as a private member's bill, and that was actually convincing one person in the ballot, who was high up in the ballot for the private member's bill, to take on the kind of the campaign and the law change. And then we worked alongside other people in the homelessness sector to look at whether or not the private members bill could be taken on by the government, and they did. And then there was a process by which that law was enacted, and it is now the law, and it was in statute in 2018.
And so did you manage to do this in the margins of that, or had you essentially built your coalition by then?
So we had built a coalition as well, and that was based on we'd actually done a lot of public campaigning by that point around the fact that I realised I'm jumping from one campaign to the other, but I do think there are kind of similarities with a lot of them. It's about kind of making sure that you have your evidence base. So we'd done some research for that particular campaign, which was around changing the homelessness legislation to ensure more people could get access to support, by doing some mystery shopping in local authorities, and people who had experienced homelessness themselves going in and presenting, and actually what that showed is that lots of people who should be eligible support were turned away. And so we were kind of built that kind of coalition with the evidence base, but also the homelessness sector, and kind of building that swell that people wanted to do something. And then it enabled us to, I suppose, then talk about it with people who wanted to do something about that, whether that's public campaigners or whether that's other MPs. I think it's that kind of making sure you are talking to lots of different people, but also understanding the responses to that. So for us, often it's about talking to local authorities who have, they have a legal duty to do something about homelessness, and we know from them they're often stretched, very stressed, and it's about understanding it from their point of view as well.
So just one more thing, and then we'll take the conversation somewhere slightly different. But what was the breakthrough moment with government? How did you get to the point where this thing that had been on the statute book for nearly 200 years was suddenly getting repealed?
So I think it was the cross-party kind of understanding that this wasn't the way to tackle rough sleeping. So I think the other thing that was happening at the time, and still is there is a target to end rough sleeping by 2024. So there's also a lot of investment going into addressing rough sleeping, and actually I think convincing kind of both parliamentarians and civil servants that actually the Vagrancy Act was not supporting that. It was actually doing the opposite.
So interesting. And I mean, you've got further battles on your hands, I know, but we can get to that in a moment. But Jason, is it fair to say you're only here because of your dad?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, something I don't often say is that I have a letter at home, and it's dated August of 1990, I believe. I'm born in 89, and it's from my dad's then MP, David Lightbound, and it says, "Thank you for coming to see me with your small child the other day at my surgery." And I was the small child, one, going with my dad to campaign to his MP about infected blood. And then here I am, 30 odd years later, still campaigning on the same issue. Well, so it's been a long time in the making.
It really has. Well, let's just start with, take people back, if you would, to first principles. What happened to your father?
So in the 1970s and 1980s, the field of haemophilia treatment changed, and haemophilia is a blood clotting disorder. The blood doesn't clot like it should, and that's because you're missing a protein called factor VIII, and I won't get much more technical than that on the side of haemophilia. But up until that point, haemophilia A, at least, the most common form of haemophilia, had been treated with a substance called cryoprecipitate, and the best way to think of that is it's like a regular blood transfusion. It came from volunteer donors on the NHS. But in the 70s and 80s, that changed, and haemophilia treatment became a commercialised business with the advent of a new product called factor VIII concentrate. That product was made by mixing or pooling together the blood plasma donations of up to tens of thousands of people who were, in the case of products we imported from America, which was most of the product, came from people who were paid, prisoners, IV drug users, people at high risk of viral transmission. And what would transpire, and arguably what was known at the time, which is why it's a scandal, is that every bottle of that product was infected with hepatitis C, which is a virus that causes severe damage to the liver, ultimately results in cirrhosis, various cancers, and then also coming into the 1980s, HIV, the virus that leads to AIDS. And so every bottle was infected with hepatitis C, and around a third of people that used the product were also infected with HIV. So my father was one of the just over 1,200 people in the UK infected with both viruses. He died when I was 4 in 93. And to this day, there are only around, we think, between 200 and 300 people still alive who are infected with both viruses. And it is really important to say that, over those decades since this happened, many people, including my father, have campaigned, died campaigning, their families have campaigned. I'm far from the only person who's campaigned on this issue, and it's incredible, really, that it's taken this long.
Your father must have known relatively quickly, but not immediately. Is that right?
So, the way the scandal unfolds is slightly different for each virus. So, because every bottle was infected with hepatitis C, every haemophiliac that used the product was infected with hepatitis C on their first use, generally speaking. So the product begins to be rolled out in a big way about 1973, 1974. And so my father would have been infected with hepatitis C around that, whenever his first use of the product was, which was actually about 1976, a little bit later on. He didn't find out he had hepatitis C until over 10 years later, basically around not far from, actually 20 years later, not long before he died. With HIV, his medical records showed that he had tested positive in the autumn of 1984, but he wasn't told about that until the summer of 1985. Fortunately, my mum wasn't infected. They'd only got married a year before he found out about his infection. And so, fortunately, my mum wasn't infected, and hence, I wasn't infected. But that easily could have been different.
And it is for some families, right? It's the next gen.
Absolutely. There are a number of women who are infected with HIV from their partner who have died as well. Some are still alive and continue to live with their infections now. I know a number of people who were the children of partners who are infected and are themselves living with HIV. That easily could have been me. Mm-hmm. So, the impact is much broader than just the person that was infected. Partners were infected, children were infected. And in fact, there's also cases where parents who were infusing this product into their children became infected through needle stick injury as well. And so, this product was literally just lethal, waiting to infect people.
And forgive me, I can't really remember the moment when it first became public knowledge that there was a scandal. And I do know, though, that there was a long battle to try and have something amounting to a public inquiry. At what point did you become an activist and a campaigner on the issue?
Well, I mean, the earliest document I've seen, I think it's 1989 or 1990. There's a document, it's a letter from Margaret Thatcher refusing a public inquiry then. And every government since then, until Theresa May, had refused a public inquiry. So that refusal had gone on for a long time. And I think, on that point, something that's very important, not just about the infected blood scandal, but I think about many campaigns really, is the narrative. Because if you go back to, we're calling it a scandal now, but back in the late 80s, the early 90s, that was not really the narrative. The narrative was, particularly from government, but also just generally, isn't this a shame? This is really sad, but it's an unfortunate accident. Who could have possibly have foreseen this would happen? And so the defense the government had at the time was, in particular in relation to compensation, the argument was, well, compensating people that have been infected with HIV through factor VIII is saying we should compensate someone who goes in for the heart surgery and they die on the operating table. We can't hold the NHS responsible for every death that happens to occur under their watch, which is obviously true.
But it was pretty obvious this was systemic, and it was...
Yes. Well, I think it was obvious to the people that were intimately involved kind of behind the scenes. But I think generally, even the haemophiliacs themselves, particularly in the 80s, did not appreciate the full extent of what had happened. And I don't think that's been appreciated until this public inquiry has happened and the evidence that it's revealed.
So when did you first, what made you a campaigner?
Well, in 2015, there was the final report of an inquiry that had been going on in Scotland called the Penrose Inquiry. And it was only around that time, you know, I was in kind of my early mid-20s, I started to pay a bit more attention to what was happening in kind of the political kind of campaigning sphere of this issue. And so I booked the day off work for the day of this final report, sat down on the couch and waited to hear something about what had happened to my dad. And all I remember from that day is the Scottish inquiry concluded that nothing could, or little could or should have been done differently. And the chairman of the inquiry didn't even show up to the final report. It was given by an assistant. Apparently he was ill, which may well be true, I don't know. But the thing was a disaster. And the images on the news were of people burning the report in the street. And there was something about that day, really, that just lit a fuse in me. And it was that day I decided I need to do something. I don't know what at all, but I need to do something. And so it was, you know, only a matter of months after that, I went to see the boss of I was working as head of marketing for an automotive company. And I said...
Coventry job.
Yeah, that's it. It wasn't Jaguar. And I said, you know, I had no plan for if this went wrong. And I said, you know, I'm either going to have to leave working here, or I'd like to, you know, work for myself and have you as a client. And the director of that company knew some degree about kind of my life and what had happened, and kind of understood and went for that option. And so I was able to work part-time to kind of survive and keep the lights on, and spend every other hour God sends working on the campaign and setting up Factor 8, trying to find lawyers, trying to lobby MPs, etc.
Just give us a brief sense of, you know, an early frustration and an early breakthrough.
Well, I think one of the first things I remember doing is I paid some online admin assistant £10 to make me a list of the first 100 legal firms that come up in Google that deal with clinical negligence or medical negligence, with their kind of contact details. And in not a very long amount of time, I'd been through all 100, and all 100 had said no. For different reasons. Some had said, oh, well, there's been an inquiry into this in Scotland. What do you want? All the answers are there. Others had said, you know, this is just far too big for us. We don't deal with this kind of thing. And, you know, it was kind of just at the point I'd kind of given up on the legal route. In January 2017, I went to something called the Justice Summit, which Andy Burnham had organised in Parliament, and he had brought together different injustice campaigns. So I'd gone from the infected blood side of things. You had Hillsborough families were there, Orgreaves were there, the Birmingham pub bombings families were there, numerous campaigns. And it was after this, on my way, you know, for those that have been into Parliament, down the steps on your way out, and there were two lawyers that happened to be in that meeting, Des Collins and Danny Holliday from Collins Solicitors. They gave me a business card, and I still had no hope. You know, I had a very dim view of solicitors at that point. Long story short, I had a meeting with them shortly thereafter. I went with a friend of mine who himself was infected with HIV and hepatitis C. We're in many ways very different people. He's very angry, very blunt, very forceful, whereas I tend to be a little bit more analytical, I suppose. And I think that's where the contrast between the two of us works quite well in those kind of situations. And I'd gone armed with a bunch of documents, walked the solicitors through them, how I thought it could get back in court. And at the end of a couple of hours anyway, they, to my amazement, turned around and said, okay, so have you got ID on you? And I said, yes. And within a couple of days, they'd written to the Department of Health with a letter before action. And that period of time there in early 2017, a lot happened. You know, we had Andy Burnham stood up in Parliament with evidence that he'd got from numerous campaigners, including myself, And he used his last speech in Parliament to say to the government, if you don't do something about this, I'm going to go to the police with this evidence. We had an episode of BBC Panorama that I'd been working on over the year building up to that, which aired, which was really good for media exposure. And then things really culminated in the July of that year. An article I'd been working on landed on the front page of the Daily Mail, and therefore it hit the Sky News press preview. It was raised in Parliament. On that same day, we lodged a group litigation through our solicitors in the High Court, and we had, I think, about 400 or 500 people that joined the legal action at that time. And then crucially, we'd managed to get a letter, and I give a shout out to Caroline Wheeler at the Sunday Times as well for her kind of role in all this. And it was signed by the leader of each of the major opposition parties, saying we support a public inquiry. And crucially, it included the DUP, who at that time were quite important.
Yes.
And 1 week to the day later, Theresa May stood up in Parliament and said, I'm announcing, well, actually not in Parliament, it was quite behind the scenes actually, but there was an announcement that there would finally be a public inquiry into the infected blood scandal.
It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, you're very generous in saying there's not all your own work, and I'm sure that's true,
No,
but it's really inspiring to hear. Mark?
So I just had a question you mentioned at the start. I'm always curious, and this actually, I guess, is for anybody on the panel. You mentioned at the start of the story that there were a couple of like campaigns also working on the infected blood scandal, and I've always interested to know kind of how, because you're not sort of competing, but you are sort of jostling along together, trying to reach the same end. And I just wonder sort of how that works. And I guess it's the same with like homelessness as well. You've got lots of people all pulling in more or less the same direction, but how you kind of navigate like different areas of expertise, not treading on people's toes. If someone launches a massive, like high-profile media bit, do you kind of hold back on yours for a bit? I'm not suggesting you all get together and have a meeting, but I've always wondered how that worked, basically.
Well, I know in terms of, the infected blood community, there were numerous campaign groups that were around before Factor 8 that are still around now. And you're totally right. You're all kind of heading in the right direction, but the same, and I've seen it in other campaigns as well, you kind of might have different ideas of how you get there. And sometimes that can, there has been, it's no secret, there has been infighting and division within our community for sure. And it is something that, it can be really hard to deal with actually. And I've seen it in other campaigns too. Likewise, I've seen other campaigns that don't have it at all. But I think it's particularly in ours where feelings are very strong, where people are dying, people have seen their loved ones die. It is there. I think the truth is, I think when it really mattered, at that time I was talking about in 2017, we were for the most part able to pull the leaders of the different campaign groups together because we were able to gather around kind of one goal of a public inquiry. There have been other issues, particularly when it comes to things to do with money, basically, where it's much more difficult. And there can be, I think, a bit of a, almost a crabs in a barrel kind of mentality where if one campaign is kind of gathering success, other campaigns or campaigners can try and bring that organisation or person down. And it's one of the challenges, and I've seen it in other campaigns as well.
Is that something that you encounter?
Yeah, I mean, I think where it works the best is where there is coalition. So really identify with what you just said there, Jason, in terms of like coalescing around the same goal. So I've already mentioned it earlier, but one of the things we did was in the one before that, it was we all kind of big homelessness charities got together and said, right, what do we want a manifesto commitment to be? And we decided at that point it was a commitment to end rough sleeping. And so we all kind of got behind that. So that's where it does really work. And I think another area where we've got some real consensus across a lot of campaigning organisations who work in the area of homelessness is the fact we don't have enough social housing. So we all agree that we need to build more of it, and we all agree on the same figure. And that really helps when you're kind of talking to government, you're kind of talking about it in the public domain, you're kind of making that case for it. And I'm not saying there are some occasions where maybe there are kind of tensions, but I think most of the time it's about kind of talking those through. And I think the other area we do a lot of work on is we identify that actually we've all got limited resources, so why don't, there's no point in crisis doing the same piece of work as shelter. Why don't we make sure that, and I think one of the things I've worked in the homelessness sector for 15 years, and so we always make sure, I've worked in different organisations, that you kind of talk to your counterparts and say, okay, so what are you going to focus on this year? What are you going to put your money into? What could we benefit from that? Also, could we add value by doing this area? And that I always think is kind of really effective.
Can we just go back to 1824 for a second? So you've built your coalition of MPs and peers. It's been repealed nearly 200 years later, but it hasn't been enacted. So you're still fighting, basically, aren't you?
Yes.
What's going on?
So I think, great that there was a kind of recognition that it needed to be repealed, but we are still waiting for that to happen. Mm-hmm. I think on the other side of that is there has been suggestions of different legislation coming in around antisocial behaviour that is going to still include, at the moment the way it's written is is looking at kind of street homelessness and antisocial behaviour. And so one of the things we're concerned about at the moment is that actually, whilst we've had recognition that the 1824 Act should be repealed, actually something else is coming in its place that actually will do something, will give similar powers. And so we continue to fight. And I think that's kind of one of the things in terms of campaigning is, you do make progress, and you have to celebrate progress, and you have to recognise where it helps people and where it really benefits. But there's often like the next thing.
You're real endurance athletes,
yes,
aren't you? My goodness. Yes. And it's the slightly distressing thing, I think, is that it feels like it's in the realm of just sort of touchstone politics, where it's Rishi Sunak talking about antisocial behaviour, and it's perhaps unintended consequences of like that rhetoric is that something like this gets sand thrown in the gears. Yeah,
and I think that's always part of the task, is to think about the counter arguments, and think about kind of, there's a very the announcement was made around antisocial behaviour. That's often quite politicians often talk about antisocial behaviour. Totally understand that, like, people who are victims of antisocial behaviour, it's very serious, but actually thinking about kind of some of the unintended consequences. And I think what we're doing at the moment is thinking about, okay, so there's that intention, but actually what is it actually going to achieve? Mm-hmm. Another area we're concerned about the implications for people with sleeping, but there's also implications for people who are victims of domestic violence. So actually, some of the antisocial behaviour kind of policy suggestions that have been brought forward are also talking about kind of looking at where people often maybe they're victims of antisocial behaviour as well as perpetrators in the same household, and it's just thinking through some of the unintended consequences and the real impacts it has on people, and also that actually a kind of hardline approach doesn't work. But obviously then it's our job to look at what the alternatives are. And you've got to keep those relationships that you're building alive and all of that, haven't you? Yeah, yeah. So how do you see the landscape in terms of campaigning and activism? They can seem like dirty words sometimes. Yes. In politics.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. Actually, I think if you ask the public about campaigning, they would think about election campaigning or commercial ads. So, in a way, the people that we work with are slightly out, invisible. They definitely aren't to the current government or recent governments, there has been just a slew of measures to stop civil society campaigning over the last 12 years, so affecting charities who often have gagging clauses attached to public funding. You can have the money, but you can't speak up about your experiences. The Lobbying Act that makes it very hard to be clear about what you can do in the run up to elections. There's wider civic space. We all know what happened around the coronation and people being arrested for having those strips to put around banners. Police admitted got it wrong, but these are new powers the police have. And it's all part of a sort of threatening of democratic space that connects up with things like proroguing of Parliament, not following Parliament, interfering in public appointments. So there's a huge amount going on. The thing that's of concern to us and lots of other people is it just doesn't seem to be getting any attention. It's not sort of in view. And one interesting thing to think about is we don't really have a kind of conception of civil society or civic space in the UK. We very much think about charity. We're very defined by charity and charity as meeting need. I think we still have that Victorian idea that charities are really there to raise money to provide hotels and food relief. Whereas it's always been a core part of charity to also drive reform.
Highlighting justice.
Exactly, shelter set up to do that.
Yeah.
But I just don't think we have a sense of that. So we've been looking at problems of how to protect civic space. And the biggest one is that there is no public recognition of the problem, which means that there is no political motivation to act, either from the Conservative or the Labour side. There's no gain or loss. So it just keeps happening.
I'm dredging this from somewhere, but am I right in recalling that you tried to convene leaders of charities to sort of be in the public space and make these arguments a lot more?
Yeah, we are. Yeah, it's a group called the Charity Reform Group. So it's a group of CEOs of big household name charities, including Matt, the CEO at Crisis, and 12 others. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to use their reach and profile to champion the importance of charities speaking up and speaking out, and actually getting through to the media as well, for example, because we don't see charity leaders in our public discourses in the way that we did in the past. In fact, Sheila McKechnie, the woman that my organisation was set up in memory of, was a very high-profile public figure. You'd be quite hard-pressed to find charity CEOs on programmes like Question Time or Newsnight.
Right.
And the reason for that is that, they're always told, well, you only work on housing. You don't have a broader strategic analysis. Of course they do. It's not the same question asked of business leaders or others. So, yeah, tiny proportion of people from our sector in public debate. And what a loss. What a loss from that debate.
And you're right there. You wouldn't bat an eyelid at a CEO of a FTSE 100 company being on Question Time.
No, you don't say to James Dyson, you can only talk about Hoovers, do you? He's allowed to talk about what he likes. So,
if only that had been the case, we would be,
With what was just being discussed as well, when you asked about problems, it's just reminded me, I think one of the first problems we hit before you even think about doing anything was how you set yourself up. So the first go-to was, we need to become a charity as Factor 8. And so we filled out the massive, requirements of the Charities Commission. And eventually, after waiting for however many weeks, they said, they refused us. And they said we were too political, because our primary goal was to get a public inquiry. So we couldn't be a charity. And there's all these other things that, social enterprises and community interest companies. And the more I read about all these things, it just felt like we didn't quite fit into any of them for what we were doing. Now, ultimately, we set up as a limited company without share capital, so basically a non-profit organisation. But even that, I did still feel that there wasn't really a space for us to even exist as a legal entity properly. It kind of felt like we kind of just mashed in. So I think that's a problem that needs addressing in itself.
I can see someone's got a microphone.
One of the things that I'm always amazed at looking at campaigners and at campaigns is not just the conviction about what was wrong or the injustice, but also the conviction about what the right looks like, about what the potentially the compensation looks like, or what it looks like to rectify that. And I would be really intrigued to hear your thoughts about how one galvanizes around what the actual response is and what the solution is. Is there flexibility in a campaign, or to be successful, does it have to be directional and quite fixed? And how do you, as you grow and support grows, how do you kind of field the different opinions around what that support, or sorry, what that solution might have to look like.
I don't know if you want to go first or.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really good question in the sense, and actually, definitely an ingredient of a good campaign is to be a solutions-focused campaign. So it's not just saying we think this is wrong; it's saying we think this is wrong, and you should do X, Y, and Z. And I think, you know, for example, the Vagrancy Act campaign I've been talking about, Scrap the Act. We purposely wanted to say, you know, what parts of the Vagrancy Act do you use for other, you know, to do with criminal justice that you still need to use. So therefore, which bits do we need to look at and make sure there are other avenues for that, and but we don't think that criminalising people rough sleeping should continue. And we've done it with other campaigns as well, which is sort of say, you know, actually, we think this is wrong, and in order to rectify it, you need to invest. You know, you're often asking for funding, but I think the other side of it is to also say, but you could actually do something slightly different. You'd do something slightly differently, and you'd still mean that you know, the people affected have a much better outcome. So I think one of the areas we really focus on at the moment is, you know, in England, the government spends over £1 billion on keeping people in temporary accommodation. So that's poor quality, not secure accommodation, and that has been going up and up and up over several years. It would be much cheaper to prevent someone from experiencing homelessness in the first place and not ending up in temporary accommodation. So actually quite a lot of our solutions at the moment are looking at how do you do proper prevention work, who would you work with? And I think that's also part of it, is it's also identifying that you're not doing this on your own as a campaigner. You need to work with other people because they'll have the solutions as well. And often people have thought about this in different areas, and it's really, really valuable to open that up. I think, you know, we've talked a bit about it already, but people with lived experience of the issue add huge value to your campaigns in terms of kind of what the solution could be, as well, in terms of thinking through kind of, and it's something we really, really focus on in terms of making sure that when we kind of set out a campaign, it's got to have solutions with it.
I'll keep my answer relatively short. I think one of the things that allowed Factor 8 as a community to be successful was laser focus on the end goal, which was one, truth about what happened through a public inquiry, and two, redress, compensation, better access to healthcare, that kind of thing. And I personally have only allowed myself to get into very few other things, you know, along that line, one of which is the Hillsborough Law Now campaign, which is the campaign for a public accountability bill. I would say if there are any campaigns or campaigners that are campaigns on injustice issues, that's an amazing group to reach out to. There's an APPG, a parliamentary group now for that, and there's growing political support for that. But that aside, I mean, we had two, you know, primary goals basically, and so any objective had to go towards that. And there were and are plenty of times still where people do ask me to become involved in other fights and issues, even ones connected to infected blood, that I have to kind of stay away from to just keep us on that track. I think it's really, really important.
Am I right in thinking that you have become quite a conduit for documents being leaked to you? And in that spirit, I mean, in the conversation that's going on now about the COVID inquiry and whether or not WhatsApp messages should be handed over, I think I've seen you sharing documents that seem germane to that.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I became known for, I suppose, was my use of the Freedom of Information Act. So since 2016, I've placed over 2,000 FOI requests now, according to whatdotheyknow.com. Great resource, by the way. And yeah, I mean, one of the documents that came out of the inquiry, which is relevant to the COVID inquiry, is this, as of 2014, there was a letter to Jeremy Hunt when he was Health Secretary, And it says the Cabinet Office had a policy of making sure they didn't unintentionally disclose material which could lead to litigation or penalties. And that document is on my Twitter, Jason Evans F8. It's pinned to my Twitter at the moment and there. And also, today I put out a video where we've just had a bunch of documents come through yesterday showing what's actually going on in government when it comes to compensation for infected blood, because we've been meeting a bit of silence over the last few months, and those documents have been quite revealing too. So I think, as a campaigner, you have to wear many hats. It's certainly something I found. You have to be a bit of a marketeer, a bit of a journalist, a bit of a freedom of information person, a bit of a people management person, be able to, take off and pick up different hats. And that was one of them, yeah.
That sounds like an amazing CV, I've got to say. Can we just get to the bit where you do something which leads you to be Campaigner of the Year? Because I think you have done something really very special in the course of, the life of this public inquiry, because it isn't finished yet. We're still waiting for its final report, but you've been very effective in pushing for real change that impacts a lot of people's lives. Could you just tell us what that was?
So the inquiry really got going in early 2018 when the chair finally began working on the inquiry. It held its opening hearings in September of 2018, and basically within a couple of years of the inquiry's work, and yes, inquiries are long things that take years, unfortunately, it became pretty obvious, I think, to most people, including, I'm sure, within the government, where this was going. And it went to places I never would have dreamed of. For example, and I'll keep this very brief, there was a school in Alton called the Tortoise School, where the inquiry basically found that the over 100 haemophilia patients who were children that went to that school were being used for hepatitis research without their knowledge or consent, or their parents' knowledge or consent. And so there were really damning, kind of shocking revelations like this coming out. It was obvious where the inquiry was going. So in January 2020, a number of us attended a meeting in the Cabinet Office with Oliver Dowden, who was then Cabinet Office Minister. I think he is again now, but in a slightly different role. Sue Gray, who is now a household name but wasn't at the time, was there. And also Health Minister Nadine Dorries, I believe, was there. And this meeting was kind of billed as a chance for government officials to kind of hear concerns of people infected or affected by the issues. And I'd gone there with a bit of a harebrained scheme, really, which was to say to Oliver Dowden, look, can we please begin something now, which I've come up with this term compensation framework, so that by the time the inquiry reports, the details of compensation have been thrashed out, so that we don't get to the end of the inquiry and then figure out, what do we do now that we know all this horrible stuff has happened, and then more people die awaiting compensation. And I had to press him a number of times, during that meeting. The first 3 times he gave me politicians' answers of, we'll see, blah, blah, blah. And on the 4th time, when I said, it's got to be a yes or no, I need to know now. And the reason I needed to know now is because I had a press release ready to go. One for if he said yes, one for if he said no. And he said no, as I assumed he would. And so the no press release went out, and that ran in the media. However, we then spent a year campaigning kind of relentlessly, really, getting all of the members of Factor 8 to write letters to their MPs, and they would raise questions in Parliament, table written questions, petitions, endless letters. This went on and on and on. And at a time when, actually, going back to one of the questions that was asked earlier, other campaigns were actually not pro that initiative. They felt actually it might be harmful to existing kind of benefits that people receive and things of that nature, but we persisted with it. And eventually, Penny Mordaunt then became Paymaster General at the Cabinet Office, and now we're a year later now. And long story, a bit shorter. Eventually, Penny Mordaunt makes a written ministerial statement saying that would happen. There would be this compensation framework exercise. Sir Robert Francis KC, who has led a number of inquiries into different things as well. Very distinguished KC, led that exercise, heard a lot of evidence, delivered his report to the government in March of last year. And in October last year, I am cutting out a lot of things that happened in the middle of this, but in October last year, the government paid interim compensation of £100,000 to people infected, still alive, and bereaved partners. I think some 400 or so million at that time. But
so you unlocked that money for all those families, even though the inquiry hasn't reached its conclusion yet.
So I wouldn't take entire responsibility for it. I mean, we did, for example, we managed to get an interim report from the inquiry recommending that as well, which really was a huge boost to get it done. But I mean, I think it's testament, I suppose, to, it starts with an idea and you have to go through these steps.
It's relentless, isn't it?
But eventually, with the right people and the right motivation, you can get there. I mean, to think really where we were in 2016 with no hope, nothing, no inquiry. And then, last year, the door to compensation, as you say, unlocked. That is a tremendous achievement of the whole community. Really.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a tremendous achievement, I think. And
you, which is why you are the campaigner of the year, 2023.
take the credit.
I have to thank everyone involved in
Yeah,
fact.
And I think that's testimony to the the endurance of all of those people who've worked on that issue for sure. But it's you've clearly brought like a real imagination and a commitment to it as well, which is
dream big, as they say.
Quite right. Okay, well look, I can see we've got a flag, and I don't know whether that's like a celebration of the fact that we have answered the question. Probably isn't. Should we just have a quick go around? How do you change the world? Let's have a one-liner from each of you. Come on, Sue.
Think big and keep going.
Never stray from your primary goal.
Be passionate and solutions focused.
And carry a big stick. I think that's a really great conversation. I really want to thank you all for coming, and thanks for attending. And I hope it gives a lot of people inspiration that even at a time when you feel sometimes helpless at the madness and the pantomime of politics, that you can just sort of get out and try and start from nothing and build coalitions and have strategies and cut through. But it's been an honour to be sat between you both with all of your hard work, and thank you for all that you guys do in convening, and thanks for coming, and thanks for tuning in if you're watching on YouTube. Once again, I don't know if we've answered the question, but we had a go. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for watching that clip. If you enjoyed that, then we think you'll love these. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to join us live in the newsroom, head to tortoisemedia.com/book.